You know the story. Two brothers. One offering accepted, the other rejected. Jealousy. A field. Blood on the ground. The first murder in human history. You probably learned this as a child. A simple morality tale. Jealousy is dangerous. God sees everything. Violence has consequences. Case closed. But Spinoza would have told you that stories like this are never just teaching morality. They are teaching you how to think about guilt, power, and violence. And there's something inside the Cain and Abel story that nobody slows down on. Something the adults who taught it to you either didn't notice or chose not to mention. Because the moment you look closely, the moment you stop treating this as a children's lesson and start reading the actual text, you find a crack. And through that crack, something far more unsettling than a jealousy parable becomes visible. Cain, the first murderer in the Bible, is not simply punished. He's protected. God curses him, and then shields him, marks him so that no one will kill him, sends him away but keeps him alive. And then Cain does something extraordinary for a man supposedly alone on the earth. He builds a city. That detail should stop you cold, and it is exactly the kind of crack Spinoza taught us to look for. Because the story that was supposed to be about two brothers in a garden is suddenly about population, civilization, architecture, and politics. And none of it adds up, unless the story was never about jealousy at all. Why does God reject Cain's offering in the first place? The text gives no reason, no explanation, no moral justification. One brother's gift is accepted, the other's is not. And from that arbitrary distinction, that unexplained divine preference, everything else follows. The jealousy, the murder, the exile, the city, all of it flows from a choice the text refuses to explain. That silence is not a gap, it's a feature, because the story needs violence to feel inevitable, and inevitability requires an origin that cannot be questioned. This is where Spinoza matters, because Spinoza taught that if you want to understand Scripture, you do not just ask what a story says, you ask what it is doing. And what the Cain story is doing is not giving you a moral fable. It is giving you a piece of political theology. And to see it, we need to follow the cracks. The first crack is the one most people notice eventually, though rarely in Sunday school. After Cain kills Abel, God confronts him and pronounces a curse. The ground will no longer yield for him, and he will be a restless wanderer. Cain's response is striking. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Anyone who finds me will kill me." Stop. Who? According to the text up to this point, the only humans who exist are Adam, Eve, and Cain. Abel is dead. There are no other people. So who is Cain afraid of? Who could possibly find him? The traditional answer is that Adam and Eve had other children. Genesis 5 mentions sons and daughters, and that these siblings, or their descendants, populated the area. The text doesn't say when these other children were born relative to Cain's exile, but the apologetic reasoning is, enough time passed, there were other people around. Fair enough as a patch. But notice what the patch reveals. The story isn't operating on the timeline it claims. It's borrowing from a world that already has people in it, hunters, avengers, strangers, while pretending that only one family exists. The narrative slips. And this is the Spinozist move. When the narrative slips, you stop treating the text as untouchable revelation and start reading it as a human artifact. In that slip, we see the seam between the story the text is telling and the world the authors actually lived in, a world already populated, already dangerous, already organized around tribal conflict and blood vengeance. The Cain and Abel story was written by people who knew what human communities looked like. They retrofitted that knowledge into a two-person origin myth. And the retrofit shows. Here's the second crack. God responds to Cain's fear by placing a mark on him, a sign that anyone who kills Cain will suffer sevenfold vengeance. This is an astonishing detail. Seen through Spinoza, this is where the story stops looking like pure morality and starts looking like administration. The first murderer in history receives divine protection, not forgiveness exactly, not redemption, but a guarantee of safety, a cosmic restraining order. Why? Why does the story need the killer to survive? If this were a straightforward morality tale, if the point were simply, violence is wrong and God punishes it, then Cain should die. Or at minimum, he should vanish. He should be erased from the narrative the way the story will later erase entire populations in the flood. But Cain is not erased. He is marked and released. He is the man the story cannot afford to lose. And what Cain does next makes the reason clear. He goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden. He has a wife. The text doesn't explain where she came from. He has a son, Enoch. And then he builds a city, named after his son. A city. The first murderer founds the first city. This is not a minor narrative detail. It's a structural revelation. Because in the logic of Genesis, civilization itself begins with a killer, not with a saint, not with a peacemaker, with the man who committed the foundational act of violence and was preserved by God specifically so that he could go on to build. If you're following this and starting to feel the architecture shift beneath the Sunday school version, subscribe, because the implications get much darker from here. Now, the traditional reading of all this is simple. God is merciful even to sinners. The mark shows grace, and the city building is just a narrative transition. The gaps are compressed timelines. The wife came from siblings. The fear of strangers reflects a later historical context. Nothing to see here. But these explanations patch the surface without touching the structure. Because the question isn't whether you can explain away the wife or the city. The question is, why does the story assign the founding of civilization to a cursed killer in the first place? Think about what this narrative choice communicates. The man who shed the first blood is also the man who built the first walls. Violence and civilization arrive together. They are not separate chapters. They are the same chapter. The story is saying, you cannot have cities without someone willing to kill. You cannot have order without someone who broke the original peace. Cain is not a villain who failed. He is a necessary figure, the one whose crime made the human world possible. This is political theology operating at the deepest level. And this is exactly the kind of thing Spinoza trained himself to see in Scripture. He was among the first modern thinkers to read these stories, not as sacred innocence, but as instruments shaped by human needs. Spinoza argued, in the theological political treatise, that the Bible must be read the way any historical text is read, by examining what the authors intended, what purposes the narrative served, and what political or social functions the stories performed. He stripped the text of its sacred immunity and treated it as a human document, shaped by human needs. He wasn't attacking the Bible. He was reading it seriously, more seriously than most believers ever had. And what he found was not that Scripture was worthless, but that it was far more revealing than its defenders wanted it to be. When you apply that method to Cain, the morality tale dissolves. What emerges is something far more interesting. A foundation myth. Not a fable about jealousy, but an origin story for human violence and social order. Spinoza helps you see why these parallels matter. Once you stop reading Cain as a sacred exception and start reading it as a foundation myth, the resemblance becomes hard to ignore. Every civilization has one. The Romans had Romulus and Remus, brothers. One kills the other. The survivor founds a city. That parallel is not accidental. Foundation myths across cultures repeat the same pattern. Violence at the origin. The killer is founder. The blood in the soil beneath the first walls. The Aztecs had a similar pattern. The founding of Tenochtitlan involved sacrifice and divine mandate. Across cultures, the same logic repeats. Someone must die for the city to be born. The soil must be consecrated with blood before walls can rise. The Genesis authors were doing something similar, whether consciously or not. They were embedding into their sacred history the recognition that human social life begins with a rupture, and that the rupture cannot be undone, only managed. This is what the mark of Cain is really about. Not grace, not mercy in the Sunday school sense. Control. The mark says, this violence is real, it is foundational, and it must be contained, not by eliminating the violent, but by regulating them. Cain is not forgiven. He is administered. He is brought under a system of sanctioned consequence. Kill him, and you receive sevenfold punishment. The violence is not erased. It is placed inside a structure of deterrence. For Spinoza, this is what Scripture often hides in plain sight. Not pure morality, but the management of human beings. This is the birth of law, not in the 10 Commandments. Here, in the mark on a killer's forehead. Think about the implications. Before any commandment, before Sinai, before Moses, the Bible embeds a proto-legal system in the mark of Cain, a system of proportional deterrence, divinely enforced, designed not to eliminate violence, but to regulate it. This is not morality. This is governance. And it appears in the 4th chapter of the 1st book, long before any formal covenant. Violence management is older than the law in the Bible's own telling. It is older than civilization. It is civilization's precondition. And the story knows it needs Cain alive for this to work. If Cain dies, the problem of violence is solved by elimination, and no system of justice is required. But if Cain lives, then the community must develop a way of managing dangerous people without destroying them. That requires rules. That requires institutions. That requires the apparatus of civilization. Cain is the man the story cannot afford to lose, because without him, there is no need for law, no need for cities, no need for the entire infrastructure of human social life. He is the first problem that required a political solution. Remove Cain from the story, and you don't just lose a character. You lose the reason civilization had to be invented. You lose the reason guilt exists. You lose the reason walls were built. The entire human project, as Genesis frames it, depends on this one cursed, protected, exiled builder. Now consider what this means for how the Bible functions. The story is not naive. It is not a clumsy myth that accidentally left plot holes. It is a carefully constructed narrative that performs a specific ideological task. It makes violence foundational but condemnable, necessary but regulated, ancient but contained within a divine framework. It gives the reader permission to live in a world built on blood, as long as that blood is acknowledged, marked, and placed under divine authority. Spinoza saw this mechanism with devastating clarity. He recognized that Scripture doesn't just describe the world, it constructs a particular relationship between the reader and power. The stories are not neutral histories. They are instruments of governance, teaching obedience, structuring guilt, managing the boundary between permitted and forbidden violence. The Cain story is the template. It teaches. Violence exists. It came early. It came from inside the family. And the proper response is not to pretend it didn't happen, but to mark it, contain it, and build on top of it. That last part is the darkest. Build on top of it. Because that is literally what Cain does. He builds a city on the foundation of murder. And the text does not condemn the city. It simply records it. The first walls rise from the first blood, and the narrative moves on as though this is the natural order of things. Because in the logic of the story, it is. This is what the children's version will never tell you. Not that the story has holes, though it does, but that the holes are functional. They're not errors. They're evidence that the story was built to do a specific job, to give a sacred origin to the fact that human beings live in organized societies founded on regulated violence, to make that fact feel ancient, inevitable, divinely supervised. Cain is cursed because the story needs you to know that violence is wrong. Cain is protected because the story needs you to know that the violent cannot simply be eliminated. Cain builds a city because the story needs you to accept that civilization itself grows from a wound that never fully heals. The man the story cannot afford to lose is the man who carries the founding contradiction of every society that has ever existed. We condemn violence, and we were built by it. Spinoza understood that once you read Scripture this way, as human literature performing political and psychological functions, you can never return to the Sunday school version. Not because the text becomes less interesting, because it becomes more interesting. Infinitely more interesting. Spinoza's real gift was not destroying these stories, but making them more legible. The naive reading gives you a jealousy fable. The critical reading gives you the blueprint of civilization. And that blueprint is honest in a way the morality tale is not. It admits what no children's Bible ever will, that the first builder was a killer, that the first city rose from exile, and that the God of this story did not eliminate the problem of violence. He marked it, he contained it, and he watched as the first walls went up over the first grave. If you're watching this and feeling the ground shift beneath a story you thought you understood, that's the Spinozist experience, not the destruction of meaning, the discovery of deeper meaning, meaning the pious reading had to suppress in order to stay comfortable. That is the story of Cain, not a tale about jealousy, a confession, buried inside a sacred text, that every human civilization is built on a crime it can neither forget nor undo. And the Bible, for all its claims to divine authority, is the first document honest enough to admit it.